All right. Good afternoon, evening, whatever time it is that you are joining us from right now. Welcome to the very first episode of the Fires in Grading Show, a show that is designed to really tackle all things related to assessment and grading reform in schools. My name is Garth Larson. I'm the co-founder and CEO at a company called First Educational Resources. Joining me right next to me here is Becky Pepler, the director of our Stagger Center at First Educational Resources, and Don Smith, who is our director of professional services. He is joining us right now from Wisconsin. Becky and I are joining you from the wonderful state of California because we're doing some work out here right now. Don, how's it feeling by you right now? How's that temperature?
I think it's a beautiful, balmy 8 degrees outside. It has warmed up for us. Yesterday, I think it was negative 15 in the morning. So it is a balmy 8 degrees for us here. How about you guys in California?
I think we're in the 60s, or at least it was a little cooler this morning, much warmer than where you're at. But I think we ended in the mid 60s this afternoon. So we'll take it.
And it's supposed to be, I think, 70 tomorrow. So I know we have people joining from really all over North America for this particular episode. So again, thank you for joining us. If you are joining and able to put some notes in the chat box, we'll be watching that. We'd love to know where people are joining us from during this episode. But to just give you a little bit of background for what we're going to be doing with not only this show, but within future shows, is really to tackle the tough issues within grading that schools are facing everywhere right now. For those of you that are not familiar, Becky, Don, and I, and Matt Townsley, who's a phenomenal educator out of Iowa, wrote a book called Extinguishing the Fires Within Assessment and Grading Reform, where we really just try to tackle some of the key concepts, thoughts, challenges, struggles, successes that we see within schools as they take on any type of assessment and grading reform, but primarily when they take on trying to adopt a standards-based grading system. But before we get going, just because we do have a variety of people that are, this might be your first time chatting with Don, Becky, and myself, I'm going to kind of turn it over. Becky, maybe can you just share with the group a little bit what's your background in education? What are your experiences? We'll get a little bit into the standards-based grading side of things, but just tell the group who you are.
Yeah, so I've been working with grading reform for quite a few years now. But like many educators, when I started as a high school teacher, I didn't really start questioning grading practice. I was just really, I taught chemistry, college chemistry, and forensic science. And I really had followed the systems that I had inherited, experiences that I had, things that were done to me when I was in school or while I was student teaching, along those lines. But over time as a teacher, I really started to see that there was a disconnect between what grades were supposed to communicate and what they actually did. So I've had an opportunity to live through this grading reform and change in my own classroom. I've experienced the incredibly tough times with that, along with been met with a lot of resistance as well. But I've also had an opportunity to see the amazing rewards in my own classroom as a result of these changes. I've also had an opportunity to work with schools across the country as they work to give some change to or clarity to their grading and assessment practices, and try to make them more, as Ken O'Connor would say, calm, consistent, accurate, learning focused, and meaningful.
And so, Don, just if you don't mind sharing a little bit, when you introduce Becky to schools or to other folks that are taking on this, can you just give a little bit, you always just give such a good introduction into the reality, what Becky brings to the perspective maybe versus a lot of other people out there?
Yeah, so definitely, I would say what Becky brings is there's a lot of us, and I put myself in this camp where I feel like I've helped guide teachers through the process. And I've had the opportunity to move schools and work with my own districts through the process, but I was never a teacher. And so there's some of us who wrote a book about it, but Becky truly is someone who lived it in her classroom. And so Becky is someone who can truly speak through the lens of, this is what it looked like in my classroom. And I think that is just a completely different lens than what I can ever bring to it, than maybe what Garth, what you could bring to it as well, is that Becky brings the true, this is what it looked like in my classroom. So when people ask questions to Becky, she can truly say, hey, this is what it actually does look like.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you hear us at any point, not only tonight or maybe in future episodes, refer to Becky as the high school whisperer. That is kind of our nickname that we have for her, because she is fantastic in front of high school staff who can, will sit there and say, this doesn't work in my classroom. This doesn't work in my content area. And she's like, well, actually it does. And here's what that can look like. Don, why don't you give the listeners a little bit of your background? What's your background in education? What have your experience has been if from a teaching and learning standpoint, and then even we'll get in a minute into some of the assessment and grading changes.
Yeah, just before I do that, I'm just going to let you guys know we do have folks here from someone went from -24 to 8 above. I don't know if you guys can see the chat on there. We have someone from Vegas, New Hampshire, Pennsylvania, Ken from Toronto, who we all know.
Hey, Ken, you were able to join. I didn't know if you were going to.
Yeah, -17 degrees Celsius this morning. We have Dallas, North Carolina. We have more Vegas folks, Vermont. We have someone from Hawaii as well. I'm very jealous of that right now. It's beautiful 80 degrees in Hawaii. So
that sounds amazing. Even though I'm in California right now, it sounds amazing.
So a lot of really great locations, some much colder than where I am and some much warmer. So my background is I taught high school science for 7 years. I always like to say I taught students through the lens of high school science, but it took me 5 years to really truly realize that I was teaching kids, and I got to do that through science. So that in itself was always an interesting, I think, transition for me, and something it took me a while, I think too long to realize. But then from there, I was an assistant principal at a middle school, and I'll talk about that in a minute of how it connects to grading. But then from there, I had the opportunity to be a principal of 2 schools that ranged from grades 3 through 9 at the time, where we had to start them up. They were PBL, completely project-based schools. So that was a really, I think, neat growing opportunity. At the same time, I was our district assessment coordinator, where I got to partner with some really talented people in our district to do some grading reform work. From there, was the director of teaching and learning in 2 small districts. So,
and for those of you that are joining live right now, if you're wondering why Becky and I are side screened together, and this is just the way it goes, we're having some technical issues. So we're working with a school district out in California right now, actually on their grading changes that they're experiencing. So we're out here for a couple of days, and my technology in terms of my Wi-Fi in my hotel room wasn't working. So it was quick, getting in here. I'm sitting on a really tall stool, so I'm not really this tall. If some of you don't know me, I'm actually quite vertically challenged. But ultimately, if you're wondering why we're in the same split screen, she's got better Wi-Fi in her room than I do. So as we're going to move forward, let's get into this a little bit. And again, thank you everyone that took time to join with us tonight. One of the key pieces is to take, again, the challenges we've heard from schools, from teachers, from our experiences working with us, even hearing from colleagues through this, and just our lived experiences, because we've all been through transitions around assessment and grading in our own context and in our school districts. But for this first episode, we really wanted to focus around an experience that we had not too long ago. So Becky and I, we were presenting to a very large school district out west, and we had about 500 teachers in the room. We had gone through a full workshop, the full day, which was just kind of the mindset around assessment and grading changes. But we were under the assumption as we went into the day that everybody had a universal understanding of what standards-based grading was. And so we went through the full day, we did the workshop, and we were reading some of the feedback from the teachers. And there was a large percentage of teachers that said, we don't even know what standards-based grading is. You just did this entire workshop. And we had to reflect to say, okay, maybe we should have explained that more, but we thought that there was an understanding out there of what they were working toward as a school district. And so for this first episode, we really just want to tie a little bit and just give some background knowledge around what actually is standards-based. Because here's the reality. If I were to ask even some of the people that are on the live session right now, if I were to ask you, what is standards-based grading? I could get 15 different responses in terms of your understanding or what your version of standards-based grading. And that's not to say anyone is wrong with their understanding, but it is that reality that we do need to have somewhat of a consensus to say, what are the changes that schools actually make? And more specifically, as we look at this episode, what does it mean for teachers? I know we have admin that are going to be watching this, but at the end of the day, if we're trying to move the needle around these grading changes, teachers sit there every single day and say, what does this mean for me? What do I need to do differently within my classroom? So this one is what is it? What is it, and why are we doing it? Why are we actually taking this on? So I'm gonna turn to you, Becky, on this first question is kind of based on your experiences, what you lived as a classroom teacher as you went through this. What are the big ideas that really schools and teachers really take on in terms of changes in practice when they're incorporating standards-based grading?
Yeah, and I think it's a real overwhelming feeling, right? So like we think of standards-based grading and we think of, okay, we're moving to standards-based grading, or that's what someone in our district had said that we're doing, or, the district next door is going ahead and doing that. But I also first want to preface that standards-based grading is what we may be doing, but that's not why. That doesn't explain the practices necessarily that we are adopting or that maybe are going to be in place in our district or in our classrooms. And I think when you embark upon that, there's a lot of fear, for one, because you hear about so many different avenues to be able to make standards-based grading work. And I think the one thing that's really helped me in my own classroom, but then also as we continue to work with schools, is to kind of look around like kind of 4 big central ideas that really, like when I think of standards-based grading, this is what I think of. It's really, we embark upon this pathway because we're looking at how we can reimagine how we communicate, right? What our students know and be able to do. But to be able to do that, like I said, I kind of lean into these 4 big ideas. And one of those is understanding that we have to, we look at the behaviors that our students have, or the work habits that we have that our students are exhibiting within our classrooms. And we look at a place to be able to separate that from the academics, right? So we take our academic standards, we end up determining what that level of proficiency on is through feedback, right? Through the ways that we assess students within our classrooms. But that big first kind of what I call like a pillar or big idea is that we need to find a way to separate the academic component and then the behavioral component. And we need to be able to report both of those 2 things separately so that we have accurate and meaningful communication in relation to student learning. The second piece is kind of looking through the lens of reassessment so that we allow students an opportunity to be reassessed without penalty, but not without process. And when we say penalty, what we mean by that is that if a student is able through a reassessment to show us that they have the understanding that we're looking for in terms of the standard or the learning target or the goal that they're being evaluated upon, that they earn proficiency, right? Or however you're deciding what those levels look like in your school or in your building, but without penalty. Penalty would mean if we would take the original assessment and the reassessment and average those together, that would be considered a penalty. If we only allow students to reassess if they score below a certain percentage or threshold, that would be considered a penalty. Or if we allow students to reassess, but they can only earn up to, an approaching or only earn up to a 75% if we're still working through a percentage-based system, those are what we mean by penalties. Right. One of the other big pillars is understanding that formative work is practice that helps guide and inform our instruction and the next steps for our students to be able to reach a level of proficiency against those standards or learning targets. But understanding that that's a place for students to make mistakes, right? So we say that we don't count formative work as part of the academic grade, and we only use our summative assessments, right? Knowing that assessments can look a lot of different ways. And then that 4th big pillar is that we move away from points and percentages, and we use some type of levels of proficiency to communicate where our students are at in relation to those academic standards, learning targets, learning goals that we have identified as priorities for our classes, and we use that as that means for communication.
Okay, so just so I can summarize that, and thank you for sharing that, but from a teacher lens, so the first thing that we do as teachers is we separate academics and behaviors and have a way to communicate those 2 things.
Correct.
The second thing we do is utilize a process for reassessment. So I think everybody on this session, or if you're watching this afterward, can agree that not all kids learn at the exact same time, at the exact same rate, and can demonstrate their learning on a predetermined time that we kind of establish. Typically, we establish this date for when we expect you to have learned this particular concept or skill, or demonstrate that, so that if a kid isn't quite there yet, there's a process to help them get there.
We'll do a whole episode on that.
Yeah. Oh, that is one that's been coming up. That 3rd big idea is just really looking at formative practice as practice and not something that is graded. And then the last one is that when we communicate student learning to students, to their caregivers, that the method that we use to communicate that is based on their proficiencies on the outcomes that have been determined in that class.
Correct.
Okay, so there we go. So for everybody watching, that's kind of the foundational piece. So I want to turn it to you, Don, just kind of knowing that and knowing kind of our definition. And again, there's a lot of others out there, but we have found that teachers are able to, and admin are able to kind of wrap their mind around those kind of 4 big ideas. From your lens, Don, because you've been an administrator in multiple districts that have gone through changes in assessment and grading, essentially getting to kind of those 4 big ideas that Becky just talked about. what do you see as like some of the challenges that come up within that process? So when we say, here's what it is, maybe some of it's why are we doing that? Or what are some of the reasons that schools struggle with making those changes?
That's a good, fantastic question. I think, Garth, that we say, what are some of the challenges? I think that's where we're going to have about 30 to 100 episodes of challenges, because I kind of get to the foundation of it, and thinking about it, it gets down to the biggest issue is that people do a lot of incredible work, as Becky just mentioned, and they go through a lot of changes, and mass, as we call it, sometimes those fires pop up. And one of the biggest reasons is just getting to the why. If we haven't built our reason or why for change. An example I'll give you is I was running a workshop, and we had a group of folks in the room, and most of these districts have been doing some form of standards-based grading for the last 10 years. And while they've been doing it, they're having great conversations. But I said to them, were any of you around, or can any of you name why your district decided to make the shift? And in one spot, there I think were 3 principals, a curriculum director, and a coach. And only the coach was the one that was in the district when the district made the switch. So here they are in the middle of this massive switch. And none of them can say, what is the original reason we made this switch? And so part of that's through just massive changes over time. But I think if you're a district just looking to start out, many districts don't know the answer to that. Why do they want to make that switch? Like so Becky just went through a lot of things that we know in the long run have some really great impacts, but people can't answer the question why. So just with that alone, and I just also just want to say, bear with us, folks, as we are getting used to our technology. We know Garth and Becky are a little grainy. Hopefully their audio is fine. If you watch the recording of this, we know that will be crystal clear, but we just appreciate you all, I think, bearing with us. But Garth, and if you wanted to bounce anything off of the why, and then I have some other tidbits as to that too. I don't know if that sparked any thoughts in both of your heads, because our goal really is for folks who are listening to have a conversation with you guys as well, and so you get to hear us have some banter back and forth.
Well, I think, one of the things that I noticed in terms of that compelling reason for change, and it worked in our scenario, may not work in every school district in terms of establishing that compelling reason, that purpose, was when we kind of took a look at what our mission was within our school district. So we looked at, and Ken, who's joining us, talks a lot about this in terms of, what are the beliefs we have about why we function as a school system in the first place? Like, what is our ultimate mission? And what I've learned, having looked at probably now hundreds and hundreds of mission statements in school districts, is there's kind of 2 words that kind of pop out all the time when you look at typically in a mission statement. And those 2 words are all students. And I think one of the things that was a compelling reason, I know like when we took this on as an entire district at the time when I was a director of teaching and learning, was we had a lot of practices in grading that were taking place that were not aligned with our mission statement, which was that we were here to support the success of every single kid that walks into our doors. And so for us, it almost became like we have no choice but to change, because we're not in alignment with what we say we're about. We're actually doing things like, for example, if we don't allow kids to demonstrate their learning another time when they've gone through a process, all we're doing is just opening up larger gaps in their learning. And so now we're about some students, we're not about all students. And so for us, like a big thing for that, Don, to kind of speak to it was, like in some cases, I feel like I don't know how we could do anything differently, because we're misaligned with what we actually say we're about as a school system and what we're actually doing within our grading practices, or just the sheer volume of punitive measures that we were engaging in terms of how, and Ken talks about this. If any of you have not read Ken O'Connor's Repair Kit for Grading 15 Fixes for Broken Grades, it is fantastic, and ultimately speaks to a lot of these kind of punitive things that we often do in grading that we believe as teachers. And I'm one of them. I'm just going to say I'm a former high school English teacher. I was the one that did all of those things in my classroom that Ken talks about that we probably shouldn't do. So I just want you all to know, like I experienced that. I lived that world. But when you take a step back and say, well, is this really what we're about as educators? And the answer was no. So speaking to that, Don, around kind of the challenge of, do we understand why we're doing it? I think sometimes we almost have to confront that practice right away to say, it's no one's fault that we're doing it, but we have a misalignment.
Yeah, and I think and a challenge I give to everyone watching this, and if you're not watching us live, is tomorrow, go into your classrooms, ask a teacher, why is it we made the switch? And if their response is because we are doing standards-based grading, something along that lines, and it's not to the core of why you say it's a district, it tells you there's a massive then misalignment there, and you have to get back to the core of why do we make this switch? And typically then when I say to folks is if it's you're making the switch because you want to move to standards-based grading, you're going to fail. And that's where we get, I think, called a lot of times where people are like, we made the switch and now everyone's is upset with us. And it's because they made the switch because the district next door to them, or they went to a conference, or they had read a book. But in reality, we say to folks, it's not about standards-based grading. It's about a journey towards clarity and consistency is typically the phrase we try to help folks out of. How are you on this journey of towards clarity and consistency? So that way, when you walk into classrooms, it's in clarity. We always say, Garth, you want to rifle off your 5 parts of clarity just quick for us?
Yes, I can do that. So first and foremost, we want to make sure we have clarity in the standards and the targets that we teach. So that's on the academic. And I would also say then the behavioral standards too, like those outcomes. So first we have to have clarity in the standards and targets. Then we have to have clarity in what success looks like. And I would say for any of you that if you've been through kind of the PLC side of things, typically we're accustomed to hearing kind of like the 4 questions of what do we expect kids to learn? How do we know they've learned? And then kind of going into the responsiveness of this. And what we would argue is one of the most missing pieces within that framework is being able to define what does success look like. Mm-hmm. So, even if you're thinking about like a proficiency-based model for grading, like if you don't know what it looks like for a student to be successful on that, well, that's a big missing piece. And we'll talk about that. That's going to be a fire that we will get to when we talk about like proficiency levels and everything like that. But there's also a critical component behind this too when we think about clarity is that not only do we need to know what success looks like in our students, but we also need to know what success looks like in our teaching practices. Like, what are the actual practices? Our good friend, colleague, runs the Jenny Donahue Center for Collective Efficacy here at First Educational Resources. She talks a lot about like collective efficacy, and one of the leading indicators for collective efficacy is understanding cause-effect relationships. And so in schools that have a high sense of efficacy, they know that when we engage in this teaching practice, it leads to this outcome with our students. And so one of the big pieces, and this is why like the change in grading is a piece of it, but it's not the main piece. It's to get, as Don mentioned, the clarity. So that's the second one. What does success look like in our students and in our teaching practices? The third then element is how like having clarity in how we assess learning. So if we know what standards and targets that we're aiming for, we have to make sure that the assessments that we're using accurately measure and give us evidence around those standards and targets. So that's the third area of clarity. The fourth one is then we have to have clarity in how we respond to the learning, which is, all right, we have this evidence of what's taken place. This is why formative assessment is so critical, because that allows us to respond to what we see. And then the fifth component, and that's really where we now get into the grading, is clarity in how we essentially evaluate and report learning. The evaluation side is the grading. The reporting side is how we then communicate that through grade books and report cards. So those are kind of those 5 components that we highly recommend. If you're taking on this work, that's got to be a part of this dialogue. It's not just switching grading practices. It's switching the entire framework for how you actually function as a school to support student learning.
I was just going to jump in also, like one of the things, I think kind of going back to where you started, Don, where you're saying like, what is kind of a starting big roadblock or challenge along the way. And I think when we think of that standards-based grading, as I mentioned a little bit earlier too, we said like, that's what we're doing, but that's not why we're embarking upon all that change. So as Don mentioned, defining that why. And I think clarity, as Garth just explained, is a huge component of that, but also a big component of that usually stems around the lens of consistency. consistency, right? Like we want to have consistent ways of reporting what our students know and are able to do. And, and I think of that from, especially when we look at it as we filter up from like a elementary to a middle school to a high school lens. And we think about what we use grades. And when we say grades, like that can mean a lot of different things. It can be a letter grade, it can be a proficiency, whatever, however you define that in your district. But we use those for a lot of things for kids, right? We use them for a lot of things in our own buildings, whether we're saying we're using that to determine if they meet a prerequisite to move on to another course, if they need an intervention, if they need, if they can be placed into certain courses, what their path and sequence is, and so many different things, right? We also, for scholarships, for GPAs, right? For graduation requirements, but we also use grades for a lot of things outside of school that we obviously don't have control over, whether that's the, rewards and punishments at home for students, depending upon how families or caregivers view grades in their homes. Kids may have to supply grades to apply for a job or to be able to apply for some type of, we have even worked with some communities where students have to apply for certain summer camps, and they look at those things, again, that changes across the country. We may not be able to control what places are utilizing those grades for. But when we start to think about the impact of inconsistency and how we report and determine what those grades are, and that goes back to that clarity conversation, we think about that, grades can potentially open doors for kids, but they can also close doors for kids. And if we have inaccuracies in how we communicate that and inconsistencies when we have, two students taking the exact same class, and knowing what that means for them. Again, whether we agree or disagree of all the things we use grades for, the reality is we use them for a lot of things. So how do we make sure that we have that level of clarity and that layer of consistency to ensure that we are giving all of our students an opportunity to be successful, regardless of whose classroom they walk into or what teacher they have?
Don mentioned a really good point about walking into your schools tomorrow and saying, why are we doing this? If you are engaged in grading reform efforts, I would take it even one step further. Walk into your classrooms or your schools tomorrow and pull your mission statements up, or go online right now and find your mission statement. Some of you might take longer to find. Some of you, it might be still like just laminated in the office right now, and you don't even know where to find it. But
signature line in your email.
Yeah, it's somewhere. It's somewhere in your district. It's there. And I would just ask you to look at it and say, okay, if we're analyzing this mission statement that we have as educators in our district, what are the current, and this even goes beyond, honestly, it goes beyond the grading practices. It really looks at like, are we in our roles as educators, are we actually doing what these words say? Or are we just kind of paying lip service to it? And so that's something to think about too, because like I said, it slapped me square in the face when I realized that there was a clear difference between what we were doing and what we said we were about. And so there's something. And the other thing that I would take it even another step further in terms of, to Don's point around, do we know why? I also would encourage you, do you have like an actual clear purpose statement for why you grade in your district? Mm-hmm. Whether that's district policy, whether that's in your high school or middle school handbooks or elementary or whatever it may be, like, do you actually have a clear purpose? Because our good friend Tom Gusky and Ken speaks to this as well. But I remember a conversation I was having with Tom one time, and we were talking about grading reform changes, and he said, one of the biggest mistakes I see that schools make is that they don't have a clearly defined purpose. And he said, method, how we go about grading our schools, the conversation around that can only occur after we have a deeper dialogue around why we grade in schools. And so that's another thing to think about in terms of, this introduction to standards-based grading or grading reform is, do you actually even have a clear purpose for why you grade in your schools? Because that might also open up some doors of dialogue to say, maybe we might want to revisit that. So then we can, once we have that purpose statement, then we can begin to say, okay, now, again, what are the policies, practices, actions, procedures that we have in our school district or in our school, and do they align with that? And if not, or if we have a really bad purpose statement for grading, maybe that's also a starting point for dialogue to say, is that really what we're trying to aim for in terms of that communication? So that's just something else to think about. But I want to I want to transition here for a second because, again, we know first thing is establish that purpose of why standards-based grading. As Don mentioned, standards-based grading isn't the goal. Clarity, consistency, accuracy in terms of our grading, that's the goal. Standards-based is an avenue to get us there. But I guess, Becky, for you, when you went through these changes in your classroom, what did you see differently? Like, because I think a lot of times, and even in the group we were working with today, they want to know, like, what's the ultimate benefit from making these changes? Besides just saying we did it and, we've got these new practices in place. Like, what did you see in terms of significant changes from a classroom level?
Yeah, I would say, like, if I had to identify the most profound change that I noticed, and I would like to preface that too, this didn't happen right away, right? Like, it didn't, like, the year we implemented
Magically.
and went live to standards-based grading, I didn't notice this right away, right? So this took some time. But one of the things for me, I think that was so incredibly powerful was to hear how the shift in how kids talked about their learning evolved over time. And what I mean by that is I started to notice over time that I used to have kids that would come up to being like, what do I need to do to get 5 more points? What do I need to do to get an A? What do I need to do to get to that 90%, or whatever those cutoffs were? And once we took those, and what we realized is they're going to continue to ask that question when that's the way that we communicate how they learn and how we use them as feedback, right, to be able to share their learning. So I noticed a huge shift as when we started to, in our district, we identified our priority standards, and then we made those make sense by developing our learning targets. And we actually we denoted proficiencies based upon the level of the learning target. And so we use those learning targets all the time in the classroom. Like, that's how we talked about learning. That's when we were talking to kids, and those success indicators that Garth mentioned before, we had those identified for all of those learning targets. And when you would hear kids now, like, so you give an assessment back and you give them feedback and they're like, okay, what do I need to do to improve on balancing chemical equations, right? Which was just one learning target that was evaluated in a unit on chemical reactions. That flip in thinking and how they communicate made for huge gains in our classroom, because now they knew what they were doing well on, but they also knew the areas that they needed supports on. And when we gave them those avenues by developing those learning targets and utilizing those and communicating student learning, they became such great advocates for themselves. And they didn't even know. I felt like this was kind of like an unintended consequence, positive. But I guess I didn't know that was going to be the result. And so that for me is probably one of the biggest takeaways of when you can hear kids talk about their learning and they can identify what they need to work on in relation to the learning that we have for, like, as an expectation for them. I felt like that was a huge shift and change, and positively as a result of changing how we grade.
Becky, if you don't mind, because I think it ties really into this entire dialogue of the change. Just for the viewers, when was your aha moment that you needed to change? Like, when was like this moment of like, oh my gosh, I really need to think differently about this? Yeah.
So, and I always say, like, when you have kind of like an aha moment that you can actually like pinpoint right to a physical moment, like, that's your aha. Mine came from a night at parent teacher conferences. And we always had our first parent teacher conference was like the beginning of November. We start school beginning of September. So a couple months into the school year. I had a parent who came in without her son, but she came in, and at the time our grade book was broken down by category. So like 50% of their grade came from their assessments, 40% from their lab work, 10% from their classwork. And so this was in our college level chemistry class at the time. So as students were taking that class, they had the option to take it for a dual credit between the high school and the college or university. And that became that was their first grade on their college transcript, right? So that was a big weight for some kids, and knowing that may have been their first college experience. And so anyways, I had a parent come in, and she was wondering how she could help her son, because he wasn't doing as well as she had hoped, or he had hoped, in the classroom. So she kind of zoned in on the assessment category, because that was weighted at 50%. And she looked back, she said, okay, well, this chapter 2 assessment, like, he really struggled there. He had a 63%. At the time, we were in points and percentages grading system. That was right on the cusp of a D to a D- in our system. And she said, well, I mean, that's the beginning of the year. And I assume that he's going to need that, those skills to continue to move on in a, kind of a high paced college level class. So what does he need to do to improve? Right. And while I know that not all parents potentially ask these many questions at parent teacher conferences, but this was that moment for me. And just to give you a little bit more context, this was, we were already into chapter 4. So I had given that assessment, 3 weeks ago. I had already given it back to the kids. So I didn't have it in my possession during the parent teacher conferences. And all that I saw glaring back at me in the grade book as I was trying to have this conversation with her was a 63%. And I could not answer her question. I did not know, I didn't remember, right, what her son did well on and things that he didn't do well on that particular assessment when I have 150 kids a day, and that was 3 weeks ago. And so I had to tell her, right? I felt like I was this big and I had to be like, can I get back to you on Monday? I'm going to talk with your son. Hope that he still had that assessment that I could grab back from him and quick go through it and be able to let her and her son know like where he needed to, what were the areas of struggle, areas for success. I left parent teacher conferences that evening. And first of all, I didn't sleep. But second of all the thought that kept going through my head was, I'm his teacher. I should be able to answer that question, and I can't. And when I even started to think a little bit deeper about that, I realized that if I couldn't answer that question, there's also no way her son could answer that question for himself. And that one evening was my aha moment of, as a teacher, I need to do something different. Like I need to be able to answer that question at like the snap of a finger, the second my grade book is open. And I need to also be able to equip my students with the ability to be able to answer that question. And so for me, that was the start of that was the aha moment, but the start of kind of that transition and change for me in my own classroom.
Becky, remind me to reach out to that parent at some point and thank that parent for asking that question, because I don't think we would have went as far down the journey as quickly as we did if you hadn't had that aha moment. So that we appreciate that. The one thing we forgot to share with all of you joining live right now is if you have specific questions that you want to ask, please post those into the chat feature there. We want to make sure that this isn't just us talking at you the whole time around some of our experiences. Yes, we have some things some common questions that come up, but please post those questions into the studio chat, or if you're joining on YouTube right now, go ahead and post those and we will make sure that we get to them. But Don, while we're waiting for some of that to come in, I'm gonna ask you, because also you're a parent, and by the way, just so all of you know, I'm gonna give a shout out to a really cool scenario that Don had yesterday as a former collegiate athlete. So Don was a college runner. He held multiple records at the university that he attended, and so when was the record broken? Was it over the weekend or was it a couple weeks ago, Don? On Saturday, someone at the university that Don attended broke his 800 meter indoor record, and he got a chance to go there for the kind of the passing of the torch per se. So if you didn't know, Don was a fantastic college runner, and so congratulations for having that record for so long, Don. And also, I know maybe what was that like? You got a chance to kind of talk with the athletes and the runners from that?
Well, the first question I asked them, because I said it 23 years ago, I just asked them if any of them were alive 23 years ago, and only one was, who I think through injuries was a super senior of some form. So yeah, that was my first question, was just anybody alive. But it was really exciting and really neat. I'm really proud of the program and the student athletes they have there and the work they continue to do. So it was definitely pretty neat.
Well, congratulations on that, for holding that record for so long. But I want to turn to you now, Don, from as a parent thinking about these changes. So again, Becky kind of alluded to, here's the benefit she saw in her students and in her classroom. But as if you look at it through the parent lens or the broader community perspective, what do you see as some of the greatest opportunities and successes that have come from schools that have really been willing to take on this work?
Yeah, and I think I also just want to take a second to thank Becky, because Becky's story is an honest one that I think exists in a really high percentage in all of our schools across really the world today. And I think Becky is one of the first people that actually admits that story exists. And I think we teachers experience that in a lot of ways, but we try to I think her humility there is really important to recognize that which then I transition to, I think our grade books, a lot of times our grade books are a collection of data that for the most part, and I hope I don't mean to offend anybody, is completely useless. In my opinion, our grade books should be a data warehouse that we can look at it and we can see where our students are areas of strength and areas of growth for them, and where we want to continue to work with them. But unfortunately, many of the data warehouses are a collection of assignments, and you see how students did in a collection of assignments, which is not at all connected to the learning we want them to have in their classrooms. And I think as a result of that, we in education end up spending millions, if not billions with a B, on programs to assess our students, to figure out what their present levels are, because the data in our grade books is useless and we can't figure out where our kids are from classroom to classroom. When we talk about consistency, talk about clarity, that we spend, I think, millions to billions of dollars every single year in education because our grade books at times are useless. Then as a parent, from the community perspective, I think we all see that. If you just pull up your child's grade book, those who are parents now, and say, what do you really know of what are the areas that your student needs to grow in terms of learning, not what assignment they need to redo or what assignment they did poor on, but specifically to learning and what are the learning outcomes we want to see. And in the places that haven't made a great transition, they're struggling. Other places that have transitioned, it's still messy because a lot of things still trickle into those grade books that maybe should or should not be, that kind of make it a gray area. And so I think our grade books just across the board are a messy collection of assignments, not a mini data warehouse of your kids' live to tell you where they are.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. I mean, I think just again, and Ken speaks to this in the repair kit for grading and I know educators, we have too many acronyms in education. We really do. In fact, I think there should be a full master's or doctorate program specifically on being able to explain all of the different acronyms. Yeah, like here they are. But what I will say is, Ken, in terms of grading changes and creating a little bit of a framework for dialogue, when Ken introduced in his most recent edition the repair kit for grading, CALM, and Becky mentioned this a little bit earlier, but again, CALM standing for consistent, accurate, learning focused, and meaningful. The meaningful piece, if I just put on my parent hat for a second, the meaningful piece is so critical in this dialogue around the change, because at the end of the day, as Don said, if we're not communicating meaningful information to our students and to their caregivers, their families, like, why are we even communicating in the first place then? Like, why, to Don's point, like, we're just giving them information that they either don't understand or does not give them real understanding of where their kids are. And so that's where even the district we're working with out here right now, the big part of our conversation today with them was, how do we make that communication meaningful? Mm-hmm. So when we can see by outcome how the student is doing, and I think about and I actually spent some time today looking at this. Like, if you think about the general professional world of evaluations in other occupations, it is all driven by how well they're doing on a set of skills. Yet in the K-12 traditional grading system is we take that and we just kind of mold it together and say, here's your percentage of what you got on something. Like, that doesn't exist. Everything is based on how well are you doing in each of these areas. Here's what you're doing really well, and here's some gaps that you have that you can work on. Mm-hmm. That's meaningful. That's for me as a parent. I want to know that. And also I want to know as a parent, is my kid actually engaging in the learning process the way that we would expect them? That's why that separation of those behaviors are so important. And Becky mentioned this to a group we were with yesterday. She said, as a parent, and I fully wholeheartedly agree, like, I care way more about that, actually. Like, are you being a good learner? Because if you're doing those things well, if you're making the attempt within the practice, you're learning from your mistakes, you're interacting well with your peers, those skills will allow you to be successful regardless of what you do in life. And so I really care about those, because I know if they're doing those things well, even if they may not be getting some of the academic skills so far, those will come eventually. But if they're doing those other things well, they're going to be successful. And so, again, a big part of what we see is one of the biggest benefits is just how more meaningful the communication is Now, that doesn't mean that there's not some learning that has to happen for your parents and your students along that.
A lot of learning.
Yeah, it's a ton of learning, and you gotta front load that. But once you have it set up in a way that they understand and that the kids understand, absolute game changer in terms of the meaningfulness of that communication.
I was just going to add on to that, like a future episode. I know we're going to jump in at some point of if we go back to the root of my frustrations, because as you heard Becky say, there's this whole question of like, will this be graded? Will this be assessed? And how do we change our buildings from being a culture of chasing points and grades to chasing learning? That's something we're all very passionate about, and that's part of the why. If you ask me why are we making this change, because we're trying to change our culture from chasing points and grades to chasing learning. But I'll tell you that if your grade book is a collection of assignments and points, then at the end, that's also a true thing of like, then we're training our kids. Like that's all that matters in the long run is the collection of points that's in the system that will be reported out. So that's one of those huge, it's not something you change in day one, but if that's the final outcome, then don't be surprised when they ask you, will this be graded? Because that's what our grade book currently is. And as I said, feel free to throw some questions in the chat. And we've got about just 8 minutes or so left of us being live. If you have a fire, we'd love to hear from you guys as well. So
yeah, and I think to Don's point there, that whole point piece, that's where we have kind of conditioned our kids. And when I say we, not anybody just joining live, like as a society, we've conditioned our kids to think a certain way, that grades are a form of compensation, that we are compensating them for something through the use of those points, versus really switching and changing that thinking to grades, reporting mechanisms as being just nothing more than forms of communication, which is an entirely different mindset. So again, just a really good point. Again, please post any questions, thoughts, wonders you have, something that you want to bring up, something that you would like to see us address. Again, the first episode tonight is really just grounded in, what is it? Again, those kind of big ideas. Why are schools making those transitions? I know a common question that comes up is, when we work with schools, are we the only ones doing this? No, you're not. You're not. This is a big shift and movement that we're seeing in schools all over the U.S. Canada obviously has more of like a competency-based approach that they've been taking on. And so, again, a big piece of this is of a lot of the school districts across the country. Terms of initiatives or focal points, this is a big one that schools are taking on. And it's one that we need to create more opportunities for dialogue like this that we have going on tonight and in future conversations. If you're not a member, and I'm just going to say this and we'll get to some of the questions. If you're not a member of the Standards-Based Learning and Grading Facebook page, which is, if you're on Facebook, that is a fantastic resource for you. Again, I kind of jokingly say I'm still on MySpace, but ultimately for those folks that are on Facebook, that is a great one. Ken O'Connor is one of the admin on that. Exceptional dialogue on that page around schools that are working on some of these changes. So here we go. Would love to hear more about the parent communication piece. What were major concerns? How were those concerns handled, especially at the high school level? So, Don, do you want to speak, like, what's the number one thing that we typically hear from parents, which I know is going to be a future episode that we're going to talk about, so this would be a good preview, but what's the number one thing we traditionally, especially from a high school lens, in terms of the communication when schools make this change?
are you saying in terms of will my kid get into blank college, whatever the major university is by
Yes.
That's the
Number one concern.
So that's the number one thing we're going to hear. I think we only have about 6 more minutes. And one of the things is that I just want to also throw out there, if like any of these you feel like I wanted some one-on-one time, we'd be more than happy to set up a separate meeting one-on-one with you guys as well to help you work through any of yours. But I think Garth will probably say in a second, the parent communication piece, the number one thing we want to start out with is what's not changing. So then parents know that, yes, your children will still get into blank university. So it's that's probably one of the biggest initial things we talk about. But the biggest concern is the university and how will they view it, how will they see it. And I'll just put a little nugget that says it's a future conversation for us to have, but go interview that college or university, ask them. And I think it's going to be really eye-opening for you. And we'll talk through that, like I said, in another episode. But you will hear, and if you can say, I went to that university, I talked to their admissions department, here's what they have to say, that'll calm your group down a ton. So just know that if a little tidbit, and we'll talk through that some of our own personal experiences, but
Yeah, and I would just say, I just really want to emphasize that point that Don made is the number one thing to help parents along in this process, as he said, is start with what still looks the same within your systems, whether that's your student information or learning management system, to if you're still keeping some form of letter achievement scores or GPA, like take out as much potential misunderstanding of what's taking place, or just information that's just not accurate to what you're going to be doing. That helps a ton in that process, and we will talk about that in a future episode. Question here, in terms of what do you think the difference between standards-based grading and proficiency-based grading is? I'll share my opinion on that, and Don, Becky, go ahead and chime in as well. I see that those two are very interchangeable with each other. At the end of the day, if you really want to simplify the statement, standards-based grading is that the grades we determine for our students are based on performance on standards. And we can say standards or learning targets or learning goals, but at the end of the day, we would say that proficiency-based grading is the same as standards-based, because we're utilizing a process. The only difference is maybe you could still have some schools that are grading based on standards in kind of more of a traditional model around points and percentages, which isn't our recommended pathway, but some still need to do that to get there. The proficiency-based is kind of when you're really putting it into practice to say, we are now grading those standards or learning outcomes based on a proficiency level. And so that would be kind of the change
That's
there.
what I would say too. Yeah.
Don, anything?
You'll see some districts then who are proficiency-based use that as the way to move kids through courses potentially faster or slower. And they attach that because there's certain states where the laws are written where you can do that, where if a student walks into algebra on day one and is now proficient in all of the standards, that they then can potentially move on to the next class. So you might see that as another big difference between the two.
There's also just a kind of a statement around kind of the unlearning of kind of the default grading is a lift. And absolutely. So I would say, just as I said earlier, we've conditioned kids to think this way. We also, as educators, are conditioned to think this way. Partially because, if I think back, and maybe some of you went to way better teacher prep schools than what I went to, and I'm not going to name the university that I went to, but ultimately, we didn't talk about grading. That wasn't like, you didn't have a class. We didn't really talk about like meaningful assessment practices. We talked about content, right? And so, especially as a secondary teacher. And so what's the standard practice that most teachers, how did they learn how to grade? Through how their cooperating teachers graded. And we kind of picked up on those practices, and then we adopted that because that's what we learned, right? So there's a big piece of unlearning that comes through this, not just with the kids, but also with us as adults. But also, if we have systems in place to support kind of what that, I would say, unlearning to relearning, like kind of going through a new phase of learning of what it can look like, I just think that we would see that we are in such a better place around how we're going about communicating that student achievement, what we're doing with that meaningful information, how we're supporting students along the way. So definitely wholeheartedly agree with you. And we'll get into in future shows on like what are some of, we are the first to say, Don will say this, Becky will say this, I'll say this. This change is not easy. We're not looking at it through rose-colored glasses to say there's not challenges. That's what the whole purpose around this show is to help navigate, because we experience a lot of those too, especially with the unlearning or relearning that takes place. But our goal is to give you some ways to kind of navigate some of those challenges, some of those fires per se that you're going to encounter. So I know we're close here to wrapping up. Thank you so much for everyone joining. Don, did you have anything you wanted to conclude with there?
Preview?
Yeah, I just want to jump in and talk about our next episode for everybody. So we'll be airing on March 19th is our next live session, and please come with questions. And as you saw in the chat, this will be available on YouTube as well as Spotify about a week once we get the things in production, so that will be available for folks. But our next episode, we are tackling accountability. One of the biggest fires we see in standards-based grading, and in my opinion, in schools in general, is there's no accountability in this system, is what we hear over and over. So we are coming at one of the hottest fires right away in our second episode. So if you're going to join us, be ready to talk about how there's, quote, no accountability in the system. And we're actually going to spend 2 episodes on it because it's a major hot topic. So Garth and Becky, anything else?
One of our big things to address, if we don't grade it, they don't do it, right? So that is a huge one we'll tackle within the accountability conversation.
So yes, can't wait for you to join for us again. Please, you've been getting information updates if you're a subscriber to this. So again, please let us know through email or any other form of communication, social media, of things you want us to make sure that we address. We are happy to do it. But thanks so much for joining us live right now. For those of you that are listening after the fact, thank you. Don, thanks for sharing your perspective. Becky, thanks for sharing your perspective. I can't wait to keep these conversations going. Join us in March.